Our speaker tonight is Dr. Whitney Howarth, who is an associate professor of history at Plymouth State University. She specializes in modern world history and the history of India. Her research focuses on the 19th century and examines themes such as colonialization, statecraft, nationalism, and identity formation. Dr. Howarth also sits on the executive boards of the New England Regional World History Association, the New Hampshire Council for the Social Studies, and the New Hampshire Peace Action Education Fund, and she's a Humanities to Go presenter for New Hampshire Humanities. So I will turn it over now to Whitney.
Thank you so much, Tricia. Welcome, everyone. I'm a little embarrassed to say that that might be a little bit outdated. Some of those boards I'm not on, but I'm on new boards. So please check out my webpage on Plymouth State University where I teach. We have a lot of exciting beverage history to cover, so I'm going to just jump in. There's a few little moments in the beginning of the presentation where I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind typing your answers in the chat, and then we'll have Tricia select a few just to give us a sense of interactivity. I've done a few online virtual talks in the last year, and I'm teaching remotely at Plymouth State, but this is my first Humanities to Go talk, and it's so much easier when I'm in the room with you, but I'm glad you're here. I'm so delighted to be talking about the hot drinks revolution. All right, so now I'm going to share my screen. And it's funny because I was just saying to Tricia that hot drinks could be interpreted in multiple ways. And this is not the talk that I would give about liquor, or alcohol, or spirits, that kind of hot drink, but I could give that talk. Maybe we'll do that one next. But this is about primarily about tea and coffee and chocolate. So buckle up. We're going to go pretty fast because I want to make sure we have time for discussion and questions at the end. So let's start off talking about tea, and then we're going to interweave a lot of different historical moments. What comes to mind when you think of tea? An image, a person, a place? Why don't you go ahead and put your reply in the chat, and maybe Tricia will read 4 or 5 of them. What comes to mind when you think of tea?
England. I'm seeing to England, the UK, afternoon with friends, my grandmother, Dawn says, Assam, British, China, the Queen, Mary Poppins.
Good, that's great. Those are all the right answers. Yay, you get an A. For me, I think about having tea with my sort of adopted grandma. This isn't a picture of her. This is a random person from Google Images drinking tea, but she was so cute, I had to use her. But I remember fondly being about 7 or 8 after school each day, having tea with my grandma and eating these windmill cookies. Delicious. So I have really warm, fuzzy feelings about tea. Even before I started reading the history of tea and teaching about the British Empire and China and India. And this is my daughter. We do a lot of tea parties with actual tea, which is very exciting when you're 5 or 6, that your mom puts real tea and not just water in the teapot. And it's funny because when I was thinking about tea, I associate with the UK and merry old England and the Queen and proper tea parties with your pinky up. But of course, we know tea was not grown in Britain, doesn't come from Britain. So I want to talk a little bit about the connection between empire and several beverages, and a little bit about the cultural history, the consumption and ceremony around tea and coffee and chocolate, and also the economics and politics of the hot beverages. So any guesses where this landscape is? These are tea bushes, of course. It could be a couple of different places. Does anyone want to write in the chat where they think this might be? Tea bushes growing.
I see India and China as the guesses.
China, yeah, good.
What country?
Okay, what country do you think of when you think of a cup of tea? We already said Britain. We said China. Any other places come to mind?
See Kenya in the chat, India, Japan.
Japan, good, yeah. Let's take a look. Where are the top tea producing places today? Well, so China's where tea is from, and let's take a look at where it's grown mostly today. And I just put up the URL in case later you want to take a look. So starting with we'll do the top 5, counting down. 5, Turkey. That didn't come up on our list. Sri Lanka. I think someone might have said Sri Lanka. Kenya, someone said, good job. India is number 2. They grow about 1.2 million tons a year. And China more than about double that. So they're their number 1 tea producers. So it makes sense, right? When you think of tea history, you don't often think about China or India right away because we have so many affiliations with the British, right? And it's interesting that we think about the British and the images that come to mind of British drinking tea are usually very elegant and sophisticated with fine porcelain and tea parties and ladies with big hats and small munchable sandwiches made of cucumber. But we really should be thinking about the bloodshed, the death, and the war associated with this crop. How many of you think about that? Probably not many of you. So I'm going to inject a little bit of that today. I'm glad many of you aren't thinking about bloodshed, death, and war when you think of tea, but it's important that we know the roots of this story. One of the things that is very unknown is that the British Empire used its full naval and military force in the 19th century to make tea the cheapest beverage, cheaper than chocolate, coffee, beer, cheaper than everything but water. Not only in its relationship with China, and you probably know the story of the Opium War, we'll talk a little bit about that later, but also in areas of Northeast India around Bengal in what is Assam and Darjeeling. A really brutal, horrible, bloody story about how they grew the tea gardens, as they call them, up in the northeast part of India. So we'll get to that story. I have a thesis, and we can prove it wrong and argue with it later, but here's my thesis argument, that without the British Empire, none of us would be sipping tea. If you have a teacup, hold it aloft. Trish, you want to show your teacup? It's perfect for my blood war and, and violence theme. Even this gentleman, Mr. Dalai Lama, might not be sipping tea if it weren't for the British Empire. So let's play with that over the course of the next 40 minutes or so. So we like to think about the tea party, the tea garden, you know, the cute old ladies and the cute children participating in the tea. Let me ask you this, what type of person sips tea? Do we think of does a certain type of person come to mind? Maybe elderly? What other types would you think of? Working class, upper class?
Jan has typed royalty into the chat.
Good. What about gender? What about race?
This might be typing everyone and some people typing women. Upper class white. British detectives.
What kind of feelings does tea evoke for you emotionally? Warm, cozy fuzzies? There's a detective sipping tea.
Relaxing, healing, soothing, calming. Those are all words typed into the chat right now coming in. Warm feelings.
It's interesting to me that a lot of you know, BBC programming or TV shows or movies about the British, it seems like whenever there's a crisis or an emotional, you know, upset, people will say, let's have tea, let's have a nice cuppa, right? That's very much the answer to, I think, many emotional problems in India, at least through the stereotype and the meme of popular culture, right? Who gets to drink tea, girls or boys, men or women? Here's someone you might not imagine. Traditionally, it's often associated with women and children. So we'll talk about how that came to be. And here's some, you know, beautiful rose-covered, warm, happy, soulful images that you can find on the internet, on calendars, you know, through greeting cards. Very much the typical kind of early, late 1800s, early 1900s. So Victorian, Edwardian, you know, Regency period is what we think of when we think of tea. And therefore, I think when we think of tea today, we've definitely been sold sort of a package of goods. And tea represents for many of us elegance, sophistication, civilization, right? So a little look at that. So the region that tea comes from isn't just China, but it's specifically the foothills of the Himalayas, or as we say in America, Himalayas. And it's really interesting to me when we look at a map. So I'm going to use my mouse. Can you guys see my mouse here? These are the Himalaya mountain range, and it goes really across the whole cap of northern India into this part of Southeast Asia. And so Yunnan and Sichuan, which is here, these are the provinces where, tea cultivation began, but the wild bushes of tea grew in the foothills. Tea requires, like coffee, a certain element of coolness and shade, a certain quality of moisture, certain type of soil, cool nights, warmer days, and elevation. So you often see those tea plantations on hills in Vietnam or Kenya. It takes a certain area to grow it. Tea might have been plucked from the wild for thousands of years, but we know that it was cultivated as early as 1000 before the Common Era. And it's so interesting to study the linguistic history of this product because the Chinese call it chai, and pretty much every civilization and culture, I looked at a map, I think there was only a few places that don't call tea some variation of chai, te, tea, Thai. And so we see this, of course, traveling, one of the few foods that maintained its original term from its original culture. As New Englanders, we have a very intimate sort of relationship with tea, at least up until 1773. And but it's interesting to me when I looked for images of early American teapots, we have teapots that date back to the 17th century, which is when tea shows up and coffee and chocolate show up in Europe. So this is from the Salem Museum. Just a real brief overview of sort of the mythology of tea's origin. And I think it tells us something from a cultural perspective that one of the early myths of the origins of tea in China surround the sort of first well-known emperor of the first great dynasty, Shen Nung. And it's an interesting story that promotes the idea of tea as medication. And again, with so many beverages, coffee and chocolate and tea, but also, distilled liquors like whiskey and brandy, sort of the two earliest distilled liquors, they were seen as medicinal primarily. And there has to be a series of sort of political, economic, cultural shifts over usually hundreds of years to see these beverages move from medicine to leisure or luxury, and then usually leisure, drinks or products that people would take just because it feels good, it's enjoyable. So the early history of medicine, but also the earliest recorded writing history is about tea being a great aid to meditation. And so we have a lot of Buddhist monks writing in China and later in Japan and Tibet about this meditation aid. So we have harvesting wild tea. Tea is a stimulant. Obviously, tea has caffeine, coffee has caffeine, chocolate has caffeine. These are one of the reasons we think they become so popular. But the idea in this case that it has a spiritual and almost sacred quality because its association with meditation. We'll talk about chocolate later. Obviously, for the Olmec, the Mayan, and the Aztec, there's a divine connection for that product. Not so much with coffee, not a divine connection. Maybe a different connection we'll talk about later. So there's a great story of a Buddhist monk who tries to stay awake for 9 years in front of a wall. His name is Bodhidharma, and he falls asleep, and he's so frustrated that he can't stay awake and be close to God for 9 years. He rips off his eyelids and throws them to the ground, and from there blossoms a tea bush. There's another story of the famous Lao Tzu, who is escaping, done with civilization, upset with the moral decay of man. He leaves to go westward and says, I'm done with humanity. I'm going to the barbarian, unsettled territory, and stops at the border. A custom guard offers him a cup of tea and sits down. They start talking his philosophy. And the border guard's like, I'm going to pour you another cup of tea. I think you should start writing this down, your philosophy. And of course, Lao Tzu writes down the Tao Te Ching, one of the most important scriptures of the East. Thank God for tea. I think we start thinking about tea expanding beyond China. It might have been before the 7th century, but especially during the Tang Dynasty, because of the Silk Roads, because of the wide variety of amazing things, silks and porcelain, ceramics, jade boxes that the Chinese craftsmen make during this time. So some of the most beautiful porcelain we have is from the Tang Dynasty, and after. One of the famous Tang emperors, Lu Yu, was so enamored of tea that he wrote one of the first books, period, sort of one of the first important printed books, and he called it the Classic of Tea. And as you can see from the table of contents here, he was obsessed with the details, everything from what was the proper utensil to how to boil the water, how fast, how hard, how long. He's a connoisseur, if you will, of tea. So there are those Silk Roads, right? And along, again, back to ancient Roman, 500 BCE, and really up until the 1500s, we have tea traveling both by the marine Silk Road, by sea and by land. And so tea is obviously going to be part of Persian culture, Arab culture later, and Turkish culture later. Here's some beautiful porcelain, I think supposedly from the Tang period, and definitely these horses and silks were from that period. So lots of culture, lots of ideology, faith systems, philosophies, goods traveling to the West. And not just one type of tea, as we know, but many types of tea. Here's a fun fact, maybe some people don't know. I don't know if you're all tea experts or not. I didn't know this till I started studying tea history about 20 years ago, that, there's so many varieties of tea, but actually black tea and green tea are often from the same bush. They're not different species. It's how it's oxidized, how it's processed. And there's all sorts of science and chemistry behind tea. Of course, they use tea as currency, among other types of currencies, from many different types of substances in China for hundreds of years. This is one of my favorite stories, is the story of how tea from the 7th century right up until the Mongols come in and establish the Yuan dynasty. Tea was like so popular initially for the royalty and the elite, but increasingly for the commoners. But then there's sort of a hard stop when the Mongols arrive in the 1270s. And we know this too because Marco Polo, who visited the court of the great Kublai Khan in the 13th century, does not mention tea at all. He doesn't write about tea. And apparently the Mongols hated tea. They preferred kumis, fermented mare's milk. You milk your mare, you throw it in your leather saddle bag or horse leather bag, and you ride through the plains in the hot sun until it gets nice and chunky and curdles and ferments, apparently, and it makes sort of an intoxicating beverage. And we're told that Kublai Khan himself had a fountain installed in the capital of Mongolia, Karakorum. And in this fountain, which she would turn on for big parties to impress people, there were 4 spouts. And this is again in around 1270s. And one of the spouts had rice beer. One of the spouts had grape wine from Persia, mead from the North and North Eurasian area, and kumis, but no tea. So it's really quite telling how for about 100 years when the Mongols ruled, China did not, I'm sure people were drinking tea, but this was not the official sort of drink of the state. And tea is going to come back with a passion and a fury to China when the Mongols go away. 1368, you have the beginning of the Ming dynasty. So from 1368 to 1644 or so, tea is back, tea is hot. And that's how the Europeans come across it. So who's this guy? He looks like he needs a soothing cup of calming tea. This gentleman's name is Alfonso de Albuquerque. And he's going to be not the first European to sip tea, but one of them. And actually, there's no recorded evidence of this. I am just surmising based on his life story, which I'll share a little bit with. You probably know that the Portuguese were the first Europeans to round the Cape of Good Hope there at the southern point of Africa and enter into the Indian Ocean, which was a thriving world economy. I always tell my students, think of the mall of the universe. Indian Ocean. Anything you want, you can get, right? Really from Roman times, 500 BCE, all the way up till, 1600. Anything you can imagine, you can shop for there. And so this is where Columbus was heading, right? The Indies. This is where the Portuguese, the Dutch, French, English later will want to get to. What were they trying to get? Spices, right? And the Portuguese show up, and they show up pretty early before other Europeans. So Diaz rounds the Horn in 1488. The Horn, Vasco da Gama, 1498, gets to India, and then this guy comes along, and he's made the Admiral of the Seas, later the Governor of India. He's some pretty fancy titles. But what I think is interesting about him is that he not only came and sort of conquered and established trade entrepôts, right, or settlements. He really took over territories, and Portuguese began to come in larger numbers to trade, and some to settle, not extensive settlement. This is, the Portuguese don't establish settler colonies, but what's so interesting is here we have the first sort of European empire wanting to establish power and control. And one of the things we know both about da Gama and Albuquerque is that they really hated Muslims. And there are a lot of instances in their own words and writing about piracy and murdering Muslims for no reason, really just for dominating the trade of this region, or attempting to dominate the 16th century trade. And the Portuguese did pretty good establishing an empire. They're going to eventually establish control of a big piece of South America, Brazil. They'll have African colonies. So Diaz comes around, then we have Vasco da Gama, and Albuquerque shows up here in Kochi. And it just so happens, my husband's from South India, and he and I have wandered the beach where da Gama and Albuquerque hung out. And there's still evidence of Portuguese colonization in the architecture and in the culture. There's evidence of the Dutch, which were the next round of empires to come in, and of course, English colonization too. But Albuquerque doesn't stop in India, of course. He wants to get to those spices. The spices aren't actually in India. A lot of people make that mistake. India really is home to black pepper and some other things that we don't even cook with. But all the spices that people talk about that Columbus wanted, like the cinnamon and the nutmeg and the mace and the cardamom, that's over here in the Spice Islands, right here by, Malacca and Indonesian islands. So these are the places that Albuquerque is going to conquer, and he's going to kill a lot of indigenous people who resist him. He's going to get involved in local intrigue and help some kings over other kings, and he's going to really try to establish dominance through military adventurism. This is a great quote, supposedly said by Mr. Albuquerque himself when he arrived in the city of Malacca in the Spice Islands. And he's basically admitting this is his agenda. We want to take these cities, these important trade entrepôts, out of the hands of Muslims, and that's going to cut off the trade through the Muslim empire, through the Muslim states, including Cairo, Egypt, and Mecca in Arabia. And that's going to stop the Venetians, the Italians, who have a stranglehold on the spice trade in the 1500s. Through by trading through all those Arab middlemen. And so if there hadn't been a spice lust, here's another theory, this is my own, maybe we wouldn't have found out about tea, or tea wouldn't be as popular. But there's something pulling us to try, Europeans, I should say, to try to control and dominate through empire these important, these spices, and also later medicinal and beverages. So here's what we think maybe the city of Malacca looks like from a 16th century source. It looks like a European city because Albuquerque is going to build a castle and a fortress there. It's also interesting to me is the Portuguese are intermarrying, some of them are settling, some of them are creating trade networks through local Muslim and Christian trade networks that exist in the Indian Ocean. And so we have early examples of, Europeans marrying Christian Indian women and Malay women and Chinese women. This starts, fairly early, often to advance commercial trade. So the Portuguese are here in India, and they're going to take Malacca, which is very close to Singapore today. And then they're going to go up to China because they like the spices, but they're really like, maybe we could get some other valuable things like silk, or let's see what else the Chinese have. And so when the Portuguese and later Dutch arrive in China, the Chinese, who call themselves at this period, right, the Celestial Empire, the Middle Kingdom, they're like, we don't really need anything from you folk. You have nothing we want to trade for, except for silver and gold. We'll take that. And so the Chinese are very controlling of who they allow in, who they give access to. And the Portuguese establish one little trading post on a tiny island, Linton, in the estuary by the city called Macau. Today, it's the second wealthiest city or wealthiest sort of trade zone in the world by many people's account. It's a place I had never heard of before I studied this, this history. So what we start to see is imperial competition throughout the late 1500s, early 1600s, and this is going to expand. But it's interesting to think about the Dutch and tea or the Portuguese and tea, because those names just, we don't think about Holland and tea drinking. We think about wooden shoes and tulips, right? And so it's interesting just to imagine that for, you know, at least 150 years, there were other rivals in the game. There was more competition than what we understand to be today. And I love this picture. Here's a picture of a Dutch East India Company Flying Dutchman ship with the flag of the company. And I don't know what this guy's drinking. He could be drinking tea. It could also be an alcoholic beverage, but it could be tea, because tea was often served in thimble-sized glasses when Europeans started imbibing. So here's a picture back in Europe of where the Dutch are hanging out, right? They're from Netherlands. I don't know if everyone knows their geography, but I find it interesting that it wasn't even the Portuguese who brought back tea first in sort of a few small cases, just to see if people liked tea. It was really the Dutch. And it's going to take a while, you know, for English people to even want to take a sip. There's not much attraction to it until someone special starts drinking it. What did Europeans think about tea when it arrived? Remember, it's being billed largely as medicinal, at least by many of the people in Asia who are consuming it and drinking it. And so it's interesting to see, like, just like today, we have doctors saying, do this or do that for COVID, you know, or this is what the vax is, or this isn't what the vax is. There were debates among educated doctors, I guess, at the time. And Mr. Simon Pauly was one of the critics and skeptics. He said, when something gets transported that long, that far, it's going to turn to poison, and it will turn you mad, especially if you drink it after 40. So there you go. On the other side, there were doctors saying, oh my goodness, it's a panacea. It can cure everything. And we urge every man, woman, and child to drink it every day, if possible, every hour, 10 cups a day. But thank goodness this doctor put a limit, no more than 200. And again, the mugs in the 17th century were not this big. They were kind of small dishes. But this is the language that Europeans are hearing even before the common people have access to these beverages, because primarily in the 17th century, it's just the royalty and the courts who have access to these very expensive beverages. What's going to change over time is, of course, just volume and access to tea. And we're going to, the English are going to have the English East India Company. Actually, that was created 2 years before the Dutch East India Company. And they're going to start realizing that there's more than just spices, that there might be reason to venture into China and see what other things the Chinese have. It takes a while for the tea thing to catch on. This is the lady that does it, right? This is our friend, Catherine de Braganza. She is a Portuguese princess, because the Portuguese love tea, or don't love tea, but they're trading some tea at this point. And she's going to marry the King of England. And she comes with an interesting dowry. She comes with two, that should say Bombay, two cities, two port cities. And I'll show you where they are in a sec. And also a small chest of tea leaves, probably worth a fortune, just a small chest. And she starts making tea popular in the court with her Portuguese ladies in waiting and other English ladies they get to know and love. The sipping of this tea. They were probably drinking it without milk and sugar in 1662, as far as we know. And they were drinking again in thimble-sized cups. But because she was doing it, all the ladies wanted to do it. And of course, because she had, the Portuguese had wealth and access to these exotic trade goods, she sort of came with an air of the exotic to the court. Bombay, today Mumbai, which is a city of 20 million today, very small city, geographically a huge population, was but a fishing village in 1662. And Tangiers was a very important strategic city here at the Strait of Gibraltar. So the mouth to the Mediterranean. And there's her little box of tea. I don't know if that's hers, but I put that there symbolically. So when she starts drinking tea, the court starts drinking tea, slowly but surely, some entrepreneurs and merchants in the streets of London and Paris and other major cities will say, well, let's start serving some of this in our ale houses to start and see if people enjoy this bitter liquid, maybe for medicinal purposes, maybe because it gives people a little kick, and because, it might be good for people who are not supposed to be drinking alcohol, like women and children. But of course, everyone's drinking alcohol for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, even as late as the 1600s. They called the brews small beers, right? They're not heavy alcoholic content. They might be mixed with water, but people are all drinking alcohol, primarily beer and wine, throughout Europe, for all ages and all meals, until we have the arrival of these other beverages. And I think it's interesting that for several hundred years, we keep hearing very medicinal language around the use of tea. And people are constantly, arguing in broadsheets and medical journals and flyers, what are the advantages? A lot of people suggest around this time we start seeing people mentioning putting milk and this thing called sugar into beverages. And sugar is not going to be widely used and consumed until around this period, 1700. And we'll talk about how sugar became cheap enough and tea became cheap enough to put them together. One of the things we know is that where the East India Company was trading very small amounts, maybe a few pounds a year in the mid 1600s, that within 40, 50 years, there's going to be an explosion of popularity for tea. And so tea goes from being, as I say here, 10 English pounds for 1 pound of tea, and then it goes to a pound per pound, which is still very expensive for the common person, but obviously more possible in 1700 for a middle-class merchant to consume tea, and not just the king or the queen or the court. I want to jump to another beverage now, just to kind of switch things up, because again, as I said, that many of these beverages we're talking about in the hot drinks revolution, and I'll talk about that term in a minute, they all show up at the same time. And they all have a history in their homeland of having been around for at least 200 or 300 years before they show up in Europe, at least. And I mean, widespread and popularly consumed in their home culture, their primary culture. So we're going to jump to the other side of the planet, where in the 1600s, Europeans are arriving and finding yet another beverage. This is, of course, chocolate. The earliest European record of chocolate is actually from Columbus's own diary. Apparently, when he was sailing off the coast of Honduras, he was on an island and met some indigenous people in a canoe, and they offered him a big bag of cocoa beans, and he thought they were almonds, and he was like, yeah, thanks, this is great, and had no idea that it would become a multi-billion-dollar industry someday. But the Aztecs, of course, and preceding them, the Mayan and Olmec peoples had long used chocolatl as a medicine, as a ceremonial beverage for funerary rites and marriage rites. There's a whole history. I just finished a beautiful history of chocolate. There's a lot of interesting research, linguistic and archaeological, around chocolate. We think that the word itself might have meant warm and bitter liquid, so it tells us that this drink too was consumed as a hot beverage. When Cortez, the conquistador, the first conquistador who destroys the Mexican civilization and takes over Tenochtitlan, when he arrives, he writes about chocolate too, and some of his men notice that Mr. Montezuma, the Aztec emperor, is fascinated and loves chocolate, that he supposedly will drink up to 50 cups of chocolate a day. It's a frothy liquid. It's flavored often in Aztec culture with water, vanilla, and chili pepper. And there's even some accounts that suggest it was part of rituals to the sun god Quetzalcoatl, who some say perhaps Montezuma thought Cortez was. There's debates about that. But what's interesting is that Quetzalcoatl, the sun god, the god of creation, was also associated with chocolate, with cocoa. And Cortez received, as part of some of his early gifts from Montezuma when they were still on good terms, several acres of a cocoa plantation in Mexico. And in fact, Cortez will go on to take this, he can't see the value of it, but he sees that it's valued by Aztecs, go on to create many more plantations throughout, there we go, many more plantations throughout Mexico, and this following Spanish will create plantations for cocoa in Venezuela, Jamaica, and other islands. We'll come back to this slide. Jumped ahead a little. So one of the things we know about the Aztecs is that cocoa had many uses, ceremonial and otherwise. It was associated with the divine, Quetzalcoatl. It was also a currency. And I have no idea how legitimate this list is, but in my Google searching and researching and reading people's blogs about the history of this, one woman took a picture from a Granada chocolate museum and said that this was a price list for things that you could purchase with cocoa beans. And I thought, well, great, you can get one turkey cock for 300 cocoa beans, one lady to stay overnight for 10 cocoa beans, an Aztec child for 600 cocoa beans, a dugout canoe for 300 cocoa beans. It's an interesting list, to say the least. But what we do know is it was central to trade and exchange and tribute systems, which were very important to the Aztec political system and economy. So how do we get chocolate to Europe? Well, again, not really wonderfully recorded, but we do have a record of some Dominican friars and maybe Cortez himself kidnapping, inviting some Mayan, some local people to come to the court of King of Spain, King Philip. And apparently there's King Philip. He looks also very much in need of a soothing beverage. He was not impressed. So it didn't really go far. It took a little while for people to figure out that you should mix tea and chocolate with something called sugar. And so I can't express this enough how unique this idea was, because again, sugar is an Asian plant. We think it comes from Southeast Asia or India. There's a lot of debates because it was cultivated 10,000 years ago. But it's something that wasn't naturally seen as a part of sugar, tea, and coffee until the 1700s. And so people are like, why are we drinking this bitter liquid? What, it does have a little kick. It's got caffeine, it's a stimulant, but there was a lot of, hesitation to adopt it very widely beyond its medicinal purpose. I wish I had more time to talk about the Atlantic slave trade, and we'll briefly cover some of those topics a little later in the presentation, because another thesis, and not my own, but another argument scholars have been making, really in the last few decades, is that sugar empowers and allows for the expansion and consumption of coffee, chocolate, and tea. That without sugar, we wouldn't have had such a widespread of those beverages, the cash crop, etc. And sugar is only possible because of a very brutal, horrific, violent, racist system called the slave trade. So this is a book I read in grad school and many years ago. Sidney Mintz's Sweetness and Power, The Place of Sugar in Modern History, has a wonderful section on tea, coffee, and chocolate. I just reread it recently. I was like, I wonder if he talks about chocolate. I'd forgotten. He does like a whole section on this. But understanding, dietary changes, understanding the economy of the Atlantic, this is all very tied to the slave trade. So I mentioned here briefly, but we will come back to this topic of how the hot beverage revolution or hot drinks revolution probably wouldn't have happened without slave trade. So Spain's going to start importing a little by the end of the 1500s. Some people will say, hey, I bet this would be better if we put some honey in it, and maybe some cinnamon from Malacca. And so people are really in this late early 1600s. It's one of my favorite world historical moments. They're mixing plants from Asia, sugar, and chocolate from the Americas, and cinnamon from Malacca to have a beverage in Paris, right? So it's a very exciting time for global cross-cultural contact and exchange. One of the first places chocolate shows up in Europe recorded was at the old coffee mill and tobacco roll, the name of a coffee house. So there we go, another drug and stimulant people found in the Americas, tobacco. It accompanies chocolate, I guess, and coffee and tea too. So here's kind of the crux of the argument, right? It's the idea that these beverages all show up at the same time. They're from all over the globe. And it's really revolutionary because it's changing how people socialize. It's changing how people are getting together to talk about political ideas. We see empires sponsoring broad commercial networks through East India Company and through the slave trade. We see all these sort of important happenings coming together through these beverages. I love this broadside or this flyer from 1685. It says, curious treatises of coffee, tea, and chocolate. And here's an Aztec sipping chocolate, I guess a Chinese person drinking, looks like a goblet, but I guess he's drinking tea. And now we'll get to coffee a little bit. So where is coffee from? Does anyone know the origin of coffee? It's the one that kind of shows up first, at least in England. Anyone in the writing in the chat where they think coffee might be from?
Nope.
Okay.
I guess I'm not seeing any guesses. Oh, here we go. Ethiopia, Sumatra, Turkey.
Yeah.
I'm seeing in the chat.
It was Ethiopia, Yemen, which are right across the Red Sea from each other. So there's little myths about each, but one of the major coffee exporting ports was in Yemen. It was called Mocha. And we'll talk about that word in a little bit. But how interesting coffee shows up, at least in England. You know, we could look at Paris and London and Vienna and Amsterdam separately, but let's be Anglo-centric. In England, at least, we see coffee showing up pretty early, then chocolate, then tea, which is, you know, again, I think a measure of how important these commodities were, how much access European traders had to them, whether they thought they were commercial commodities that could be profitable. And it's really not until the 1700s that people start purchasing these things to make it home, which is also interesting, the arrival of the coffee shop after the ale house and tea gardens, and then the idea that you could make these at home. Coffee is not easy to make at home in the 1600s. Chocolate's really difficult to make because they don't have bars of chocolate or powdered chocolate. You're actually working with a chocolate bean. Tea is the simplest to make, but not the easiest to get until a little bit later. So here's my this is the summary of the thesis slide, and I'm just gonna go through it real fast. What's fascinating to me about tea, coffee, and chocolate, they all arrive at the same time from China, Arabia, America to Europe. They're all bitter, and this is also Sydney Mintz's point. They're not served with sugar or any sweetener in their original homeland. They're all heated in liquid form. They're all drugs. They're all deemed medicine by their original sort of the myths and legends that surround them. They are all drinks of the elite and then later become more accessible to commoners. Non-alcoholic, not really nutritious. They get cheaper and more common when sugar starts being consumed, again, late 1600s in Europe. They do rival beer and wine. They never beat beer and wine, but as far as a breakfast beverage goes, they certainly are winning out in the 1700s. They are desired initially by the poor as dietary supplements, because again, when they are consumed with sugar, they're often eaten with bread, with butter. It makes a cold meal, bread and butter, a hot meal. It brings comfort to even the people who can't afford protein, cannot afford a lot of meat in their diet, even don't have a lot of access to vegetables. They're sipped in a dish. At least in the late 1600s, it was a penny for a dish of coffee. And they're also full of caffeine. So it's better than being in a drunken haze, which I think most medieval people were probably just walking around in. And they talk a lot about the connection between the Enlightenment and clarity. Would we have had an Enlightenment if everyone was drunk? Did we need coffee in those coffee shops to have deep philosophical thoughts about the social contract? I think this is an interesting kind of fun thing to think about. Coffee houses, now to switch to coffee in my remaining time here, coffee houses were often seen as places of political sedition. And this was not just a European thought. So coffee goes from Ethiopia and Yemen into the Ottoman Empire world, up into Constantinople to Cairo. There's even a famous scene in the 1500s when the beg or the emir of Cairo puts coffee on trial because the question is to Muslims, is it an intoxicating beverage? Is it something that removes you from your prayer, from your connection to Allah? And so in Turkey, in Constantinople, for a period, coffee is outlawed because people show up in coffee houses throughout the Middle East, and they talk politics. And they argue about the rights of man, and they argue about governors and the abuses of their various leaders and religion and other controversial topics. But there's conversations you have in a coffee house you don't have in an ale house. And of course, there's no ale houses in Cairo and Istanbul in this period. So when the coffee does arrive into the Europe that's full of ale houses, it's interesting that kings and queens alike think maybe the Turks are right in outlawing coffee houses. They are places of sedition. They're places of where political turmoil and rebellion are fermented. Europeans are very slow to drink coffee, slower than they are to drink chocolate or tea. And there's a really interesting reason for that. Again, think about Albuquerque, think about Vasco da Gama, think about the Crusades and the Reconquista and the centuries of Islamophobia. Coffee was seen as the Muslim drink. And as such, it had religious prescriptions against it. None of these beverages show up in the Bible. That's a strike against them. But because the coffee is widely consumed, again, between the 15 and 1600s, people are afraid of it. And so Christians, the Pope himself weighs in on this issue in 1605, and later, Christian leaders preach from the pulpit, to beware of coffee. The Pope apparently tried it and loved it. And he's like, this is so good, we can't let just the Muslims have it. And I think that's quite interesting reaction. But what if the Pope had said, no way, this sooty, black, disgusting beverage is of the devil? Maybe we wouldn't be all consuming so much coffee. Again, to be Anglo-centric for a minute, coffee goes through Vienna and many, many places in Europe before it gets to London. But I think it's interesting that the first place it shows up in London is actually 2 years before it shows up. The first place in England, 2 years before it shows up in London, is in a little town with an old university called Oxford. So coffee shows up first in England in 1650, in Oxford. And I always ask my students, do you think that was a coincidence? There was a Lebanese Jewish merchant who opened the shop in Oxford, and college students need their caffeine. And then, of course, an Armenian gentleman from Turkey opened this coffee shop. This is the actual building in London a few years later. Funny, now it's a wine shop. So we have this arrival of coffee. It always has a stigma associated with it. Again, not just the Muslim stigma, if you will, but also that it's a beverage of troublemakers and political, traders. And so do you remember this guy? He's the husband of Catherine de Braganza, the Portuguese princess who came and married the English king. I think this family just doesn't like coffee because they love tea, but he actually tried to outlaw it and tax it and get it, get ale houses, or sorry, coffee houses less popular than they were, because he was fearful of people gathering in coffee houses to overthrow him. I think it's interesting too, the gendered component of all of these beverages, like when and where people decide they're more appropriate for men or more appropriate for women. Each of these three beverages has a gender story. My favorite, of course, is the 17th century tracts that women put out in England against coffee, claiming that it would decay English vigor and that it would Frenchify their men. We know the English don't like the French and vice versa at this period. The women's petition also said things like the fact that men who drank coffee could not have sex. They would become impotent. I wanted to read the exact quote from the document. It says, the women's petition against coffee, representing to public consideration the grand inconveniences accruing to their sex from the excessive use of the drying and enfeebling liquor. Talking about coffee here. The women complained their husbands were drinking so much coffee, they were becoming unfruitful as the deserts. from where this unhappy bean, berry, is said to be brought. Furthermore, since men were spending all their time in coffee houses, from which women were prohibited, quote, the whole race was in danger of extinction. Oh, who knew? The men, of course, were not to be outdone. This is an actual quote from a 17th century tract in response to that petition. And the men argued it made their erections more vigorous, their ejaculation more full, and gave them their sperm a spiritual ascendancy. I'm going to leave that right there. Coffee is much cheaper than tea because, well, for various reasons, because of politics and military imperial competition. We have different moments in Asia where access to tea becomes easier. And then the trade with middlemen in the Arab country makes coffee initially expensive, but then later easier to get. We see that by the early 1700s, the Chinese are opening those ports in Macau and allowing more access to tea. And we also see that the British are increasing their naval power, their military dominance, beating the Dutch, taking over a lot of the Dutch trade. Really, the 1600s was the century of the Dutch, and 1700s is the century for the British. So less monopolies from the Dutch, more access for the British, cheap tea for everybody. All right, I'm going to move a little bit along. There's a lot of information that's fascinating, but I'm not going to get into the economics so much because I think that would take a little more time to explain. Culturally, I'm fascinated by, again, the aspect of these beverages in terms of what they mean to national identity and how national identity is being formed in the 16 and 1700s, especially in England, and the class consciousness as well as the gender consciousness around identity issues. One thing that made tea very popular and accessible was a gentleman named Josiah Wedgwood, who in the late 18th century realized that most common people could not afford china, that is porcelain from China. And so he mass produced fake china, faux china, with the same themes and patterns. And for most people in England and beyond, you couldn't tell the difference between a Wedgwood porcelain and a real piece of china. So this was an attempt by the common people, right, to get to show off their status, to show that they had what the elite had, which was, of course, real china. Catherine the Great of Russia apparently was one of the first celebrity endorsers of Wedgwood china because Wedgwood created a line called the Catherine the Great, Queen of Russia line of china that people could purchase, and it had came with a little endorsement from her that she liked Wedgwood's china as much as the real stuff from China. I think it's interesting that women were not allowed in England in coffee houses. In France, they were, but many English men did not want to partake in their political tobacco-filled discussions in the coffee house with the ladies. And so it was in 1717, the first dedicated tea house for women to buy both dry and wet tea. Tea they could make at home, but also a cup of tea. That Mr. Twinings came up with this idea. And he bought a coffee house and then opened a stand by buying the house next door just for ladies. Coffee house for men, ladies there. Sexuality and tea is another fascinating topic, which we won't have time to delve in too deeply because I see my time is running short. But I just wanted to say that it was during this period around the 1730s, 1740s, we start seeing people coming together for more elaborate ceremonies around tea drinking in public spaces. And there's a wonderful story of how men would go to the tea gardens in Vauxhall, accidentally step on the train of a young lady and beg forgiveness and offer a cup of tea in recompense for their being clumsy. And this is how love affairs would start. In a time, obviously, when upper middle class ladies were always chaperoned, tea gardens sort of offered a space where you could meet people of the opposite sex and share a dish of tea. So we don't often think about sex and tea, but there you go. I'm going to skip over the Boston Tea Party. I'm sorry. Maybe we'll do tea too, just because I put a lot more here than I knew we'd probably have time for, because I really do want to talk about the fact that New England especially was enamored with tea until the Boston Tea Party, and then sort of protested by not drinking tea, or drinking smuggled tea, or not drink, I should say not drinking British tea. But one of the things that made Americans love tea prior to 1773 was that they were importing lots of sugar from the Caribbean. They were importing molasses, which is a byproduct of sugar. They were importing molasses to make rum, which is distilled molasses. And you probably know that all throughout Portsmouth and Portland and Boston, there were massive distilleries distilling molasses to make rum, which became a major part of the African slave trade. So the rum runners were often people from Boston who and Rhode Island who would send rum distilled here, made here, to Africa to purchase slaves for guns, for gunpowder, for manufactured goods, but a lot of rum too in that trade. And so I think as New Englanders, we sometimes like to think, oh, we were all abolitionists. We didn't believe in slavery. We didn't rely on slavery. And it's really a myth, because many New Englanders made their money through subsidiary or supplementary industries like rope making and butter we shipped to the Caribbean, and chocolate and farming making farming implements and candles and rope. And so we as New Englanders are very tied to the slave trade and benefit from the importation of some of these goods too. A lot of people don't realize that only 5% of all the slaves went to North America. But again, our economy is so much a part of the triangle trade. 60% of all slaves, 10 to 12 million of them, went to Brazil during the 350 years of slavery. 35% went to the Caribbean. And again, this is where sugar, tobacco, coffee, molasses, rum are all being made. This is such an interesting chart to look at, because I think we often think of slaves in like Alabama and Georgia and the Carolinas growing cotton, but to remember how vital sugar was to Europeans, starting again in the mid 1600s, right up into the 1800s. Most of the slaves are working on sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. And again, this feeds that desire for hot beverages, for the tea, for the coffee, for the cocoa. And look at that, 2.3% of all slaves imported to the Americas are working on cocoa fields. It's not something you think about or hear about. They were in Jamaica, Hispaniola, parts of Latin America. All right, so the last thing I think I'll end on is just recognizing the inhumanity of this institution, recognizing the trauma, the intergenerational trauma for people who were enslaved and their descendants. And for me, again, linking these hot beverages to the sugar, the commercial sugar plantation system is really important. And this is what I tell my students, we can't forget that the reason slavery existed was obviously for the profit of slave traders and slave owners. And it was part of a larger Atlantic economy. But the bottom line is people wanted sugar for their tea, their coffee, their chocolate, their cakes, their pastries. So when I look at a map of the Atlantic Ocean, I'm often thinking this is a very sweet and bloody sea. It's literally full of at least 2 million Africans who died in the Middle Passage. And that's not counting the 4 to 10 million Africans who died in Africa, who never made it even off of the coast. They died in resistance, they died in the slave dungeons, they died trying to be involved in the commercial economy that selling rum and guns created, that increased tribal warfare. We can't even begin to understand the numbers of people who didn't even weren't even part of the Atlantic trade, who never even came off of the continent of Africa, but were still devastated by it, as were societies, right? And this is for largely sugar. And I think that's just, it's kind of a sobering reality. All right, I see my time, Tricia, so I'm gonna skip down to the end. There's a lot of great more stories about how coffee, again from Ethiopia, becomes central to Latin America. This has to do with slavery as well. We often think about Brazil or Colombia as the coffee making centers, even though it's from Ethiopia originally, and that's because of slavery. Slavery wasn't outlawed in Brazil until 1888. They were the kings of coffee in the 1840s, and sugar. Gonna sip ahead. The last thing I want to say is that sugar, coffee, and tea were also increasingly cheap and increasingly commonly consumed in the 1800s, largely because of British imperial adventures in China with the Opium Wars of the 1840s and 50s, and also in India. Again, back to that story of Darjeeling and Assam. Tea drinkers today, again, think of tea as this gentle, genteel, sophisticated drink. And I think what they don't study or realize is that it wasn't just a matter of asking the British asking Indians to grow some tea in India. There was a very bloody history of the native people in Assam and Darjeeling being conquered, being exploited, being violated, being rounded up, being labeled criminal for resisting, gross human rights abuses for centuries so that Europeans could drink tea. And we think about those genteel little tea parties in England, and we forget about the blood and the horror that accompanied empire and made tea available and cheap to all of us. I'm gonna end on this picture, my favorite. I often think about Violet Crawley in Downton Abbey, who was living in this story in 1912 to 1926. Did she think about, or did she have any idea about what was happening in India, in China, in the Caribbean, a few decades before? What the blood and exploitation and horrors of empire perpetrated on people who didn't participate in drinking tea, coffee, and chocolate, but made it possible for all of us. Thank you so much.
We can take a few questions if people want to stay on and ask a couple questions in the chat. We had a few come in, so I'm gonna ask them. So one of the questions referred to a slide about tea in Britain, and the question was, what did wet or dry tea being served mean?
Thank you. Yeah. So in 1717, Mr. Twinings opened a tea stand, and he served wet tea. That means cups of tea you could drink on the spot. And he also would sell dry tea leaves. And people, women of means, would bring their locked tea casket from home. They wouldn't send their servants, and they would take a few handfuls of the tea and pay and lock the box and bring it home. So both the tea in the cup and the dry tea.
Interesting, thank you. Another question, this is a specific tea question in the chat. At least 40 years ago, I drank a tea named Assam Flowery BOP. What did BOP mean?
I don't know. Yeah. I know it must have come from Assam. Yeah, have you tried Googling it? I don't know. That's a great question.
Oh, Gail in the chat is up on this. Broken Orange Pico. We have some true tea aficionados in here.
I know, and they're out there. I'm always nervous when I present. I know nothing about the mixing of teas. All I know is that you can get good mixes.
We had a question in the chat about whether we recorded tonight, and yes, we did. So I can send that to people. You can email me if you reply to your registration email. You'll get me. And I'm actually thinking we should have done separate presentations, Whitney. I think we need to have you back to do one on coffee, one on sugar, one on tea.
We can do liquor and alcohol too. I didn't get to the distillation.
Right. So we're just gonna have to break these up. So a couple more questions in the chat. I see. Where'd they go? Oh, was there less tooth decay before sugar? Asks
oh my goodness, yes. Although one of the earliest stories we have is apparently Queen Elizabeth was a sweet tooth and her teeth were completely black because of sugar, and that's pretty early. Yeah, Sidney Mintz talks about both dietary concerns with sugar and tooth decay. And one of the theories he has is as people were eating more sugar in the 17 and early 1800s, and obviously we're sugar crazed now, that increasingly dietary nutrition was going down for women and children. So women and children were suffering because the breadwinners of the household, the men, would get the protein. And as fruits and sugars became cheaper, and really fruit in preserved in sugar, like jams and molasses, etc. Not molasses, what's that? Marmalade. they were always the food of the women and children. And especially as women went to go work in the Industrial Revolution and weren't home to bake bread and to make soups and porridges and broths and stews, more and more people were just consuming more bread and more marmalade. And it was horrible for their teeth and for their diet. I'm sure diabetes was born in this period, but also that it was very gendered and very much about who had access. And more people were drinking more tea and eating more bread because those are delicious together. So the fact that people were using that sugar as a substitute for real nutrition and calories was really problematic for a century.
A question from Carolyn. She says, how widespread was that belief that coffee houses were for troublemakers?
Is everything I've ever read, especially in the Ottoman Empire and also in Austria. So I don't know, if that was mostly just the records of the kings and the the political leaders, but that's who we have records from. Everyone was concerned with that.
Lois asked, what would you say is the ethical and moral status of the production and consumption of these products today?
Chocolate is the worst. Chocolate is the worst. Chocolate is now mostly coming out of West Africa, mostly from child labor, great human rights abuses. If you have to eat chocolate, buy fair trade chocolate. Otherwise, you're eating children's blood. That's what I teach my students. Sorry, it's true. The tea plantations are better than they were before 1947 in India, but there's still widespread sexual abuse and violence and human rights abuses on plantations. I know more about India than I do about plantations in other societies. I don't know much about coffee plantations. I'm going to guess that in Colombia and Venezuela and Brazil, there's a lot of trouble with just monitoring human rights generally.
Thank you. And John asks in the chat, did Aztecs process coffee and chocolate in any way similar to today?
So I've read a little bit about this because I'm fascinated that chocolate is actually fermented. So you have a big cocoa pods, you open it up, you take out the slimy white beans. So chocolate is actually the seeds, right? And then you have, and I've tried to figure this out. I need to go somewhere where they teach me how to do it, but you have to dry them, you have to ferment them. There's different processes historically than there are today, obviously, for that process of fermentation and drying. You have to roast them. So to get a real coffee bean, chocolate bean, it looks very different than what comes out of the cocoa pod. And again, as I said, I think it was until the 1840s, 50s that we have chocolate bars. They figure out how to mix the chocolate butter back into the cocoa. And really the same time we're figuring out how to make cocoa powder. So you'd think that would have come sooner, but it didn't come for 200 years after chocolate arrives in Europe. So yeah, please read. I'll find the name of that book, The History of Chocolate. It's delicious.
And I had one more question. I saw Amy, I think in the chat, asked if you could show that slide again or say again what the percentages of enslaved people involved in the production of
sure.
coffee, tea, and
I think it was 50-something% were sugar. Let's go back and find that. And cocoa was 2.5%. Which isn't huge, but it just surprised me because you don't associate with slaves with cocoa. So here is that slide. Let me just hold on. Sorry. There it is. I'm going to share my screen. Yep. Any other questions?
I see a lot of comments and thank yous for a wonderful program. I think we got all the questions.
All right. And can you guys see that slide? Yeah. So 54% sugar plantations. Yeah. And cotton's pretty low, right? Cotton's pretty low because, again, that was just the 5% of slaves that end up in North America.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you very much to Whitney for this presentation. I know we need to break this out into separate presentations and we'll do a whole series. I think actually we should have done a whole series, the hot
food and beverages. I love the history of the potato too. Come back for the potato.
Yes, let's do that as well. And we'll take suggestions. So you can email me with your suggestions and we'll just keep Whitney busy.
Yay. Sounds good. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. We'll be sending you a survey in your email soon, and we'll post the video as well. Please stay tuned to sign up for our Human Ties e-news with upcoming programs. And thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
Bye.